Jane McCall and the Twilight Stacks. Chapter 1. The Migraine. Jane rubbed her temples, hooked her glasses in the front of her shirt, and dropped her face on the desk. Her headaches had been getting worse over the past week. She tugged on her hair, which didn't help, and considered how bad it would have to get before she begged her math teacher for a trip to the nurse. She'd missed too much school because of doctor's appointments already this quarter. Missing any more would put her even further behind, and it wasn't as though the nurse would do anything for her. Still, the urge was tempting. It already felt like something was trying to dig its way into her skull. Or out of it, she thought, as another scrape of pain clawed at the back of her head. She bit back a whimper. Sam, her deskmate, looked over. "Are you all right?" she asked. Jane nodded, then tried not to tear up as her pulse throbbed hard enough to feel in her eardrums. She screwed her eyes shut and pressed her forehead into the desk's top. Her fingers had started to tingle, and it was spreading up her arm. Migraine aura. Ugh. The first time she'd had one of these auras had been 3 months ago, and they'd been happening on and off since then. The associated headaches were never as bad as the current one, but the way her fingers would tingle, then feel clumsy, weak, and thick as sausages at the slightest provocation had been old by the second time. Medicines hadn't been able to do anything, and she'd resigned herself to riding out the sensations as they happened. Didn't mean she had to like it, though. "Let me know if you need to hurl. I'll get you a trash can," Sam said before turning back to the front of the room. She was a pal. A different student might have asked questions Jane didn't want to answer. They were in the back of the room, so the teacher hadn't noticed them. Small mercies. Teachers had a tendency to write Jane off as trouble because of her fashion preferences. Dark clothes, chunky silver jewelry, black nail polish, and heavy eyeliner. It was better than it had been a few months ago, when they'd been treating her like a delicate flower. A few months ago, Jane had been the victim of a drugging, a stabbing, and an ankle dislocation, courtesy of her former favorite aunt, Caroline McCall. Her teachers, having been informed, had trod carefully around the topic and consistently offered her extensions and accommodations. Only a few had been particularly subtle about it. Other students had taken note. Of course they had. As a result, Jane had become a flash-in-the-pan source of gossip and speculation. It had gotten to the point where kids she'd never met before had come up and asked about the stabbing. A few days of that, and Jane had snapped at an asker, then withdrawn into a snarky shell and changed her style. People had stopped pestering her shortly after, for the most part. The occasional brave soul would risk asking about her health, and she tried not to be mean in response. That had become the new status quo, and while she didn't like it, the situation was an improvement. Jane was tall for her age, with broad shoulders and gangly limbs. Adolescence was doing her no favors in terms of looks or grace. Zits were an intermittent but unavoidable plague which stood out against her pale skin. The one thing she had going for her was her long, dark hair, which she kept silky with copious amounts of shampoo and effort. The goth clothing had started out as an image change, but she had developed a fondness for it, especially the textures of the accents. Most of her current wardrobe was in shades of black and red. The bell finally rang, and Jane scooped up her books in her non-aura-affected hand and hurried out before she could get caught in the crush. She dumped them in her locker and hurried to the gym. PE was always rough. Perhaps it was a stereotypical thing to think, but Jane's reasons stemmed from a deeper well than a dislike of exercise. She didn't have to worry about that. Coach Kinney intercepted her at the door. The coach was stick-thin, wrinkled, and always wore a grimace like she'd bitten into a wedge of lemon. Jane had grown to dislike her on principle, as had most of her peers. The feeling was mutual. The coach held out a sheet of paper. Jane couldn't participate in class for another couple of weeks, but she still needed the gym credit to graduate. The coach had gotten around this by having Jane sit on the bleachers and watch the other students play while filling out a worksheet about the activity. It always made Jane feel like everyone was watching her. She took the sheet and forced herself to reduce her frown by a few degrees. "Thanks," she said. The situation wasn't the coach's fault, and the headache definitely wasn't. "Civility never hurts," her mom's voice whispered in the back of her head. Jane pretended to ignore it. She climbed onto the bleachers, failed to find a pose that didn't hurt her rear, and crossed her legs. Her hand was drawn to the brace around her ankle as though compelled, and she tugged at the top edge half-heartedly. Physical therapy was helping, though progress was slow. With the brace, she should have been cleared for PE. She would have been if it wasn't for the other issue. She let go of the brace and ran her fingers over the part of her shirt which covered the ropey scar a quarter-inch below her belly button. The scar was 3 inches long, itched constantly despite the application of ointment, and stemmed from the source of her current frustrations. Apparently, major abdominal trauma required more recovery time than a dislocated ankle. Jane felt fine and had expressed that opinion multiple times. So what if she still got tired easily and her abs hurt after minimal exertion? She'd rather do PE than be the center of attention. The worksheet was easy. All of them were. Jane finished in about 5 minutes, then spent the rest of the period with her head in her hands trying to make her headache go away. The aura had subsided, but that only helped a little. Halfway through the period, a girl from English came over to make sure Jane was okay. She forced herself to smile and nod. An excuse about staying up late the night before earned her an understanding noise and freed the girl to return to the floor. Jane considered the merits of climbing under the bleachers. Trying to make it through a social interaction with an acquaintance by proximity while also under the weather was exhausting. She couldn't wait to go home. When the bell rang, Jane turned her worksheet in. She put her headphones on as soon as she made it to the hallway and made a beeline for her locker. There was an advantage in the few-second head start she earned by not needing to change. It didn't stop the sound of slamming doors and chatter from piercing through her temples as more students filled the halls. Her headphones helped, but not enough. She grabbed her jacket and hurried to the bus. After greeting the driver, she dropped into her seat and buried her face in her backpack. The dark helped more than the headphones' shoddy noise canceling, and the aura was finally gone. It almost made up for the engine's vibrations. 20 minutes, and she could rest. The bumpy ride hurt. Once the bus pulled up to her house, Jane all but dashed off and tumbled through her front door. The family's half-grown Australian shepherd, Jess, greeted her by dancing around her legs. Jess had a red merle coat, an endless supply of energy, floppy ears, and the cutest little pink nose. When she was excited, her tailless rear end would wiggle in a happy dance. The whole family adored her unconditionally. Jane leaned down to give her a scratch behind tan and ginger ears. Digging her fingers into the downy puppy fur there was like petting a cloud. Jess would cry if Jane stopped petting her and didn't distract her quickly enough. She'd do the same for anyone, and her tendency to greet people at the door meant someone could get stuck in the entryway for an hour while Jess alternated between receiving and demanding affection. The family had long since discovered this and came up with a solution in the form of a basket full of balls next to the door. A tennis ball rolled down the hall sent Jess scrambling after it and freed Jane to make her escape. She raced into her room and shut herself in the closet. While she did store her clothes in there, she'd also long since built a nest at the bottom. The 4 walls were lined with comforters and pillows, and there was just enough space for her to curl up without cramping. She'd have to relocate in a few years, but it worked well at her current height. Once in the dark, she could finally open her eyes without feeling the urge to claw them out. She'd never been afraid of shadows, even as a child. If anything, she found dark, cluttered spaces comforting. The closet was far from perfect, but the soft clothing inside and near-total darkness made up for its claustrophobic dimensions. The headache diminished to the lowest levels it had been all day, and Jane groaned in relief. Then the fatigue hit like a train. She closed her eyes. A nap seemed like a fantastic idea. Homework could wait until after dinner. That was her last thought before falling asleep. Queries, kudos, or concerns? Like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.